All right. Thank you, everybody. Today, I want to talk about a couple of different topics. I'm going to spend the majority of the time talking about the first premise in the title there is sugar sweet. We'll get into that, what that means in a little bit, and then spend the last 10 minutes or so, hopefully, just talking about some of the other things on your cost-per-leaf spot database that you may have wanted to know, but we're afraid to ask. So I got a lot of stuff to cover. I'm going to move fairly quickly, but let's go ahead and get right into it. What do I mean by is sugar sweet? Well, first of all, I want to make sure that you understand I didn't misspell sugar. What sugar stands for, those of you that may not know what I'm talking about, is the SMBSE Agronomic Practice Database Super User Group. Those are the guys that take time to answer all those questions and give us the information we need, which is very important as we continue to try to maintain the products and the active ingredients we need. We use all of that information to help to create our case. I might also add that sweet has a little cryptic name, and that should become more apparent to you as I give my rest of my presentation. But through this figurative discussion on whether sugar is sweet, I hope to establish that determination of successful sugar beet production is not necessarily well-defined, specifically at Southern Minnesota beet sugar, but maybe not even in our industry as a whole. Let me get into that a little bit more, because when we have a difficult time with determining success, it can create some confusion if trying to identify the most profitable sugar beet production practices or the most profitable sugar beet production groups. So I'm going to be talking a lot about some of these acronyms, and I think most of you know, but I just want to make sure, because I'm going to be using them interchangeably and fairly quickly. So extractable sucrose and extractable sucrose per ton are going to be abbreviated throughout my presentation as ES and EST. They're both quality parameters, right? ESA is pounds of extractable sucrose per acre, and TPA is tons per acre. Most of you know this. I just want to make sure, because we're going to be moving through those fairly quickly, and I can't pronounce them each time I use them. So from sugar beet perspective, what does success look like? You know, if I'm a dog and I'm looking for a bone to chew on, and I come home with this, I'm going to say this is a pretty good day. But what's a pretty good day from the eyes of a shareholder who's trying to grow sugar beets? Obviously, a profitable sugar beet producer is good for our cooperative, is good for all of us employees. That's what we're looking for. So profitability is certainly something we're looking for. And so why should the answer to that question be so significantly important to us? Well, I'd point out what Peter Drucker said, and that is, if it can't be measured, it can't be improved upon. So we need to make sure that we know what we're measuring, so that we can distinctly know where we sit, we can set our benchmarks, and we can improve upon it. Yet it seems to me that the relative importance of our contemporary parameters, be it ESA, EST, or whatever you may want to be utilizing, especially when they're viewed independently, can be difficult to determine and can change to the situation. Now, notice I let a little breadcrumb for myself there, a little asterisk, because I want to talk about, because this is really fresh in our minds, right? We just came off a 2021 crop where we created an abundance of tons, so many that we had to incorporate a controlled harvest. Usually when we have an abundance of tons, the topic usually switches to EST, right? Because if we can create more sugar per ton of beets, we don't perhaps need as many tons to maintain our efficiency, and we can still make a lot of money. But 2018 and 2019 are not that far in our rearview mirrors when we were a little bit deficit on the tons to maximize our factory throughput. Those are each parameter is unfortunately not intimately related to the other. So when we use either one or both, it can make success rather difficult to assess. And let me try to draw that point home. And I'm struggling here. Is that my size of my presentation that's causing this? Anyway, let me try to drive that point home between the relationship of EST to ESA. This is a graph that Todd Giselli's put together for a discussion at the board level. This is 10 years of production. There's a lot of fields on this particular graph. And if I could grab my pointer here, I'll tell you that we have ESE here along the y-axis with increasing levels of EST. And you can see that there's a relatively loose relationship that as you increase your EST values, you see a corresponding increase in ESA. But I would like to suggest that those observations suggest that EST and ESA are only loosely correlated, certainly not intimately intertwined. And let me try to explain that. If we look at the R-squared, that's the correlation or regression coefficient. And what this means, if you look at that 0.445, is it's indicating that only about 45% of the variability in all of those numbers you see regarding extractable sucrose per acre can be explained by the EST. So that's not an enormous amount of relationship there. And I think you can understand that when you look at the ESA equation, because ESA is actually the product of EST times TPA, and EST gives no indication to the root yield whatsoever. So technically, the R squared could not be over 0.5 in this case. So although they are related, they're probably only loosely related. And so when we only have loose relationships between EST and ESA, our primary measurements for success currently, it can potentially create a circular argument. For those of you who might struggle with Excel spreadsheets like I do, every once in a while, you probably know what I mean by a circular argument. And that is trying to decide which parameter to use and when to use it. And I think that the N management case study that I go into in a little bit later in the presentation will help drive that particular point home. So talking about some of the issues with current measurements for successful sugar beet production, we know that sugar beet production is a function of sucrose content and yield. Quite frankly, purity is very important in that sucrose content because it indicates how much that we can extract. But I think that it could be said that sugar beet processing and granulation is regulated by sucrose percentage, but is ultimately governed by the restrictions linked to total yield relating to storage and processing those beets. We live along the 45th parallel of the world, and that means we have significant summers. We cannot just take an overabundance of tonnage because we currently, at least in our current technology, do not have the capabilities to store them throughout the summer. So tonnage or overproduction of our crop can be a little bit of a detriment. Let me stop there and make sure that before we get into this whole discussion, because it's going to get interesting here really fast as we start to introduce some new concepts, success will continue to require consideration to yield and sucrose through the parameters that we currently use. All of those that are mentioned right there that I showed you earlier on the second slide of the presentation. Even though collectively they are not exactly closely related, and that makes the potential for specific assessments of success kind of difficult. And that can be difficult across fields, across operations, across factory districts, across companies, and across the United States. This whole idea of trying to utilize these combinations of our current parameters makes assessment of success kind of difficult. So to prove my point, I want you to consider a very relevant and ongoing internal cooperative debate over nitrogen fertilization guidelines using our current parameters as our benchmarks for establishing an optimum range for field management. Now, David Mettler discussed this, actually gave me a nice little pre-endorsed indication of what I'd be talking about, because this is kind of difficult. And I think you'll see what I'm talking about as we get into these next couple of slides. So when we utilize an extractable sucrose-based curve for N management, you've seen all of these, right? You've seen the quadratic curve. That was 10 years of data that David and his group put together. You saw David just recently talk about the quadratic plateau, where I think we're all fairly familiar with the quadratic plateau. John Lamb talked about this particular graph. You can see my red line there now. This is where it plateaus on the right side. That's pretty important because shareholders very quickly see that in risk of and benefit ratio of nitrogen management, they see that slope going off to the left as being pretty scary. So they'd rather make a mistake on the right side. So anybody using an ESA-based equation to determine their nitrogen management is probably going to want to play on the right side of that graph. Agreed? David also showed this negative linear response that we have to EST with nitrogen management. In this case, we have the extractable sucrose along the x-axis, and I didn't fail to mention my axis last time, with incremental increases of total nitrogen along the x-axis. And as you can see, we definitely have a fairly negative linear response. Obviously, if you're using EST then to base upon your nitrogen management scheme, you're going to want to be playing on the left side of that graph. I think it's an important point now to realize that some folks ask, why do we have a single nitrogen rate? And I'm going to use that asterisk there to make the point, because generally speaking, when we're using EST and ESA, we have to choose something that intersects or grabs that intersection where we generally don't fall off the cliff to the left or fall off to the cliff to the right. So that's where that 125 to 130 that David was talking about represented that new single numeric value. But what do we know now? We have opened the window, freedom to operate, right? So you guys know that we have our new nitrogen recommendations that float somewhere between that 100 to 110 all the way up to 150. I just want to use this point to talk about how important extractable sucrose per ton is. Because if we just use the extractable sucrose per ton at the 100 side versus the 150 side, there's 6 pounds of extractable sucrose per ton in there. If we were able to hold all things equal across 3.6 million tons, that would be about 216,000 hundredweight of sugar, if I did my math correct, at $32 per hundredweight, about $7 million. Certainly, those people that want to use extractable sucrose per acre cannot deny that extractable sucrose per ton, we can't ignore the left side of that particular graph either. So let me ask you, if you were making nitrogen recs for southern Minnesota beet sugar, which parameter do you think provided the best indication of successful sugar beet production? Well, I think that regarding nitrogen, the group that was talking about this, including the Shareholder Resource Committee at the board level, quickly recognized that ESA, which is extractable sucrose per ton times TPA, can reflect too heavily upon the yield while not enough on sucrose content, whereas EST is concerned with sucrose content exclusively and gives no consideration to yield or factory throughput efficiency whatsoever. So any endeavor to identify the most successful sugar beet and nitrogen management rate, or quite frankly, any other input that we might be measuring, becomes pretty difficult, if not impossible, when no parameter exists by which to accurately measure it. Remember what Peter Drucker said, you have to be able to accurately measure something before you can improve upon it. So this begs the question, can an alternative method of measurement be developed to recognize the relative magnitude of current yield parameters that we currently have at our disposal that more accurately predicts the type of sugar beet crop that creates maximum revenue to the shareholders? And here's where I'd like to introduce a potential solution. All right, this is not Greek, it's not Latin, and it's not Spanish. It's ESTESA. And what ESTESA stands for is a score that utilizes a very specific balance of EST and ESA to hopefully provide an indication, a very sharp and accurate indication of the grower opportunity for revenue per acre. It's really not all that creative, the name, because I basically just took EST and ESA, crammed them together, and voila, we've got ESTESA. It's a concept that I basically conceived while listening to opinions over what parameter to use to establish an optimum nitrogen fertility strategy. Honestly, the discussion literally went from ESA to EST, back to ESA, back to EST. It literally went back and forth because we know inherently that they're both fairly valuable to our overall success. Now, I gave myself a triple breadcrumb here because it's important. ESTESA provides a better prediction, and I'm going to prove this to you, of the generation of shareholder revenue than either ESA or EST alone. And another breadcrumb for myself to remind you that if this is going pretty quickly and you've never heard of ESTESA before, and you're really needing to play some catch up, I challenge you to do this. Anytime I say the word ESTESA, think about or replace it with the words shareholder profitability or shareholder revenue, because that's essentially what we're trying to do with the ESTESA score, is create a score that is tightly correlated to the grower ability for revenue, creating revenue per acre. How did we create this score that accurately predicts profitable sugar beet production? Well, I have to get a shout out here to Ian O'Connell, our CFO, because he provided me with over 11,000 fields and 10 years of production in order to develop this profit prediction model. Basically, he gave me some of the financials for every field over 11,000 years so that I can run regressions and coefficients, correlations and regressions to these particular specific field-related financials to find the one that provided the greatest prediction. And I might mention that in this particular, when I took the screenshot, I was looking at 3 iterations, okay? As I created iterations, I would compare them against the standards that we currently use. I would compare them against the best one I currently had. I probably went through a dozen, maybe 2 dozen of these particular iterations before we settle in on the one that I'm going to hopefully be able to describe for you in the next coming slides. So here, don't anybody go get some coffee. It is after lunch, by the way, but I know I talk pretty fast. You're probably holding on to your chairs so that you can just keep up here. But we are now entering the stat zone. In order for me to give some credence to this entire process, I think we need to talk about a little bit of the background, just how I think that it really does do an adequate job of predicting profitability. First of all, when we're creating something new, you got to get adoption. Challenges are involved in this. So creating something that is both understandable and meaningful becomes important. And I thought to myself, when thinking about the population dynamics, what's something that everybody kind of knows about? And I thought to myself, everyone's had a high school instructor or a college instructor that just gave massively evil, horrible, and difficult tests to the point where nobody got scores above 80. So how do you give anybody an A when you don't have anybody scoring above 80? Well, if you remember those tests, you can remember talking about them, don't you? When you're in college, they say, yeah, this guy grades on a curve because his tests are so hard, right? So what they're talking about is this normal distribution curve, okay? A normal distribution curve represents trait distribution expected from any population. So that could be the nose color of guinea pigs, it could be the rate of gain for hogs, or it could be the profitability of sugar beet producers, okay? So just about anything can fall under some sort of normal distribution curve. And if we go back to the test score example, I think I can draw this home. So if we have a bunch of students in a class that only average 50% on their test, the professor might say that anybody between a 35 and a 65 gets a C because that represents the mass majority of the people in that population or that particular class. And then it filters out to the other outside of that normal distribution curve, okay? Just wanted to try and drive that home because now we're going to talk about some of the assumptions that are associated with any normal distribution curve. First of all, one standard deviation from the mean represents about 2/3 of any particular population. Okay, 2 standard deviations of the mean represent about 95% of any particular population. So when we're talking about shareholder revenue or profitability, we kind of are interested in this group that lays over here. I mean, they are above 2 standard deviations of the mean in extraordinary sugar beet production. What are they doing? This gets to be interesting, or particularly any traits such as nitrogen management. We want to know that percentage that is excelling, that really stands above everything else. So when we create this normal distribution curve based ESTESA parameter, we had to take into account something that was adoptable and something that made sense. And the normal distribution curve is pretty much something that the kind of the world lives by from a population perspective. But it also had to make some sense from a numerical perspective. And I started thinking about this base 10 type of thing. We all know how to rate Sir cost per lease bond on a 0 to 10 ratio. We all know how to grade ourselves on an exam from a 0 to 100. And we also know that when Kirby Bucket went 6 for 6 in Milwaukee Stadium against the Milwaukee Brewers, he was batting 1,000. So 1,000 based ratio for this ESTESA score would represent a very good score all the way down to 0. So you can see that across the bottom. And I also wanted to make some of these numbers relate to a normal distribution curve, specifically when we're looking at that 750. So what we did is we looked at that 750 ESTESA score. 387 out of 11,740 fields possessed a 750 ESTESA score or greater. So although a normal distribution curve would say that 2.3% of the population exists beyond that second standard deviation, in reality, your fields across 11 years, there was about 3.2% that stood above that. I'm okay with that number because that's a pretty representative number of a normal distribution. And to prove how normal your production fields are, we are going to look at a histogram coming up. But before we go there, I want to make sure that I understand that this is on a field by field basis, okay? You generally range from about 0 to 1,000 on individual fields. It's a little different when we get to operations, but here is a histogram of all 11,740 fields, okay, on the y-axis by ranges of ESTESA score along the x-axis, ranging from about 90 all the way up to about 900. So there is a little room to grow on the positive side. And if I draw a best fit line, I think that you can see that your production fields over 11 years does follow a pretty normal distribution. It might be a little more stepwise on the left, a little steeper on the right. That's not surprising because the right's hard. That's really hard to achieve. Those are the guys that are really doing a good job. So it starts to fall off rather quickly when you're excelling at your production. But what I found very amazing and very advantageous to this program is that the median does actually sit right about 500. That makes sense. If you're a 0 to 1,000 score, you'd want your median to be about 500. That's pretty easy to remember, right? That second standard deviation from the mean means 750. That means those people that are at 750 or above are producing extraordinarily profitable sugar beet production. Now let's take a look at operations, okay? This is a little different now. Operations are a little bit skewed to the left, not as quite a high a score. We'll talk about that, but what I was pleased with is that even when you base it upon operations, 252 operations, all of those fields, average across their operations, it still averages about 500. The 2 standard deviations from the mean, rather than being 750, is about 600 to 650. I'll call it 630. Now, here's the point. Averaging good and bad, as well as early and late harvested fields across operations does tend to lower the top end. That makes sense, right? If you take all your fields early, you're not going to be able to get a 700 score because you took it so early, because sugar beet is highly influenced by when you take the crop. It also lowers the top end of the curve, you know, so we don't have any 900s now. We're peaking out at about 700. So that's the difference when you look at operations. But it's these operations at the operation level that we're going to start to examine in on to find out which operations have these extraordinary traits that allow them to be so profitable. Now here it comes. The normal distribution curve, ESTESA by the numbers. Here it is, the enormously long and complicated equation. Get your pencils ready. ESTESA is ESA divided by 2 times the decimal equivalent of ES. Most of you are saying, holy crud, this guy's going to talk for 30 minutes about something as simple as that particular equation. But remember, simple is important because that leads to adaptability, right? The other thing is it's not quite that simple, because I'm going to break out ESA, because remember, that's EST times TPA divided by 2 times the decimal equivalent of point ES. Why this iteration? Because remember, it gives me a 0 to 1,000 score. That's fairly easy to remember. And it also gives me that whole normal distribution and allows me to settle in on a couple of numbers that really seem to make sense. Everything seems to be pointing to something that really could potentially work here. I also want to point out that ES and EST are both quality-based parameters. So we have here a full quality-based parameter here. We've got a half a quality-based parameter here because it is divided by 2. And then we have a half a root yield-based parameter. So that comes out to about a 3-to-1 quality to yield ratio. That's the whole basic premise behind the ESTESA score. Now, if we could take a look at some of the numbers. Remember, I told you that 500 was right about the median? Okay, well, there's a field, an actual field. Here's your average field across 11 years at Southern Minnesota beet sugar on an ESTESA score. 499.98 is the actual field. That field had an extractable sucrose per ton of 281, 25.4 tons per acre, and a 0.14 extractable sucrose percentage. When we go to the right side of the graph and look at those extraordinary groups, this is an actual field, not an ESTESA score of 953.5. That particular field had an extractable sucrose per ton of 320 pounds. 37.3 tons per acre, and a 0.1598 extractable sucrose. Obviously, that's where we need to be trying to emulate. That's the direction we need to be going to become a profitable sugar beet cooperative. How did we compare ESTESA versus the current parameters for predicting grower payment? Remember, Ian gave me that 11,700 fields on a field-by-field basis. But that's difficult to look because it gets noisy. So I'm going to actually break that down and prove to you with a little bit less noise. Okay, so what I did is I averaged the whole crop yield parameters for each year from 2011 to 2021. That's 11 years. So there's each one of the graphs that follow is going to have 11 dots on it. We're going to basically try and create a correlation or regression best fit line. I also calculated the grower payment and the revenue per acre for each one of those particular years using the profitability calculator. And what follows then is a graphic correlation of various sugar beet parameters to their ability to predict shareholder financials or revenue per acre. I know it's small. Please let me try and walk you through this. Basically, what I want to talk about first of all is extractable sucrose ability to predict grower revenue per acre and grower payment per ton. From a grower revenue per acre perspective, it's got an R squared of about 0.38. Now, remember what I told you about R squared. They provide the proportion of the results of a dependent variable. In this case, it's the grower payment or the grower revenue that can be explained by the independent variable, in this case, extractable sucrose. In other words, extractable sucrose percentage is only able to predict the variability in the grower revenue per acre at about 38%, okay? Now, if you go over here to to the grower payment per ton, it's able to predict, extractable sucrose percentage is able to predict the variability in your grower payment per ton by about 61%, okay? So I would say that it gives that extractable sucrose gives a reasonable prediction of grower payment, but probably not a really good indication or prediction of your grower revenue per acre. Let's look at extractable sucrose per acre. This time I'm going to start on the left side of the screen. Extractable sucrose per acre along the x-axis here, and its ability to predict grower payment per ton along the y-axis is able to predict it at about 73%, R squared value of 73%. That's not too bad. It knocks it out of the park. Look at how nice and tight that best fit line fits those dots across those 11 production years. It's able to predict the variability in your grower revenue per acre at a tune of about 94%. That's pretty solid prediction of your grower revenue per acre. And that's why people tended to try to utilize extractable sucrose per acre to predict success. What I want to talk about is your ESTESA score. The ESTESA score, contrary to the others, is able to predict both your grower payment per ton at a tune of about 86%. It's also able to predict your grower revenue per acre variability by about 97%. So in other words, it improves prediction of both your grower payment and your revenue per acre to the shareholders. So a normal distribution curve based ESTESA score appears to provide a more simple method to accurately predict grower payment and revenue per acre. All right, so some of the opportunities. There's a lot. I think there's quite a few. There's things we don't even know about yet because we're just entering into this whole realm. Some of the opportunities that we can obtain possibly through ESTESA. The Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Shareholder Resource Committee requested extraction of the practices of the most successful sugar beet producers at our cooperative to identify practices that lend themselves to high profitability so that we can mimic those. However, the ability to assess shareholder profitability without actually using grower financials has always made this a very difficult process because we don't want to expose that kind of information. Thus, this established ratio of root yield to quality parameters that is capable of predicting revenue could theoretically assist with a selection. Now, remember, I say assist. We're not going to replace any of the other parameters. It's used as an additional tool to select the most profitable sugar beet producers. Examination of the practices then of this elite group, this by premise, by hypothesis, by theory, then is able to reveal particularly specific inputs that increase the odds of overall success to a cooperative, making our overall financial pie even bigger. In other words, then, we would identify and try to emulate a group of highly profitable sugar beet producers based upon an ESTESA score, because it actually does a better job than either an EST or ESA alone. But I would ask you, what might we call this group? I would like to suggest, because I'm running short of time, that we really quickly move into this and say, let's call them shareholders with economically extraordinary tactics. Why would I choose such a long name? Because a SWEET program needs a sweet name. All right. So it actually makes the acronym SWEET. You can start to get the gist of my title now, but you're going to ask yourself right away, I want to be sweet. I want to be in this extraordinary group. What does it take to be sweet? These guys that are producing sugar beets at this profitability level know what they're doing, right? So what does it take to be sweet? Well, you can't do it by just eating your sweeties. Now, I've been eating my sweeties, and I like a little bit of sugar on my sweeties, so it maybe kind of fits into this a little bit, but you can't just do it by eating your sweeties. This is what it took. So what we did is we had Jody complete a ranking of shareholder operations from the years 15, 17, 19, 20, and 21. Okay, double breadcrumb for myself because I want to make sure that I remind you. You're going to ask, why not 16 and 18? I think it's obvious, right? We had epidemic proportions of surpassed leaf spot, overwhelmed some of the practices of these groups, and it really complicated the numbers. So we just eliminated them, made a very nice set of numbers. A section of these top performers then have been selected. All right, they have not been informed yet because we still wanted to introduce the whole concept to everyone because fairly new method of trying to determine this. But I honestly think about the only method that we'd have been able to delineate these high producers. This group is going to remain anonymous. They're going to know they did it, that they're in the group, but even other members of the group aren't going to know about this because of the importance of understanding that these folks are going to be trying to give us some information, because the expectation of this group is providing production input information annually through this Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Agronomic Practice Database, the SUGR program. The list can and will change over time. It's going to stay the same for a while because we got to examine their practices, but by necessity, it may have to change over time based upon adequate number of years of growing beets, future direction, emphasis of the whole entire program, and factors as yet undetermined. So this gets into the title of the first part of my presentation, and then we can move into some of this cost per leaf spot database information. Preliminary findings. Is sugar sweet? All right, 2 out of every 3 of the ESTESA-SWEET, the top performers, participate in the Sugar Agronomic Practice Database. I could have said that I would have hoped it meant a little bit better, but still, 2 out of 3, 67% of the people on the extraordinary range are participating in the Sugar APD. And I know some of you in the audience are going, that Sugar APD is kind of cool, but it's not what makes those guys tick. It's not what makes those guys that profitable. And you know what? That's an argument we can take up on another time, but I will want to turn that around on you, okay? What I want to tell you is that there's a high propensity of these people that exist on the high end that value your cooperative enough to be wanting to share the information we need to help maintain the products that you utilize And these are the folks that are really cooperative minded people. That's what it's telling me. I will want to step on my soapbox a little bit on this one though. 3 of 4, 75% of the people in the ESTESA-SWEET utilize the Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Soil Sample Analysis Program. That's important to me, and I'm going to tell you why I think it's important. Speaking of the Soil Sample Analysis Program, if there's anyone who does not know about this, is a program that Southern Minnesota Sugar has instituted for many years now to cover the analysis expense of soil samples for confirmed shareholder fields. You can see the asterisk, certain requirements need to be met. The participants, the shareholders, are only responsible for the sampling fees or the people that go out to take the samples. In fact, we actually have added an additional $2 per acre participation incentive to try to cover some of those sampling fees. It's a pretty good deal just to find out what your soil sample fertility is. But here's why it's really important this year. Borrowed this slide from the AgVise Labs Winter 2022 newsletter. Take a look at their residual nitrate following corn in the 0 to 2. They are playing in levels that we haven't seen for a couple of decades now. We have some potentially high nitrate, and talking to the soil samplers, it's highly variable. You don't know what you got until you actually dig into it and find out. A little closer look at our own data, and you can see that it's a menacing trend back upward after a low down there in 2020, which corresponded to a pretty good sugar production year, right? So now we're heading back out of that into some higher levels of nitrogen, which could make growing quality sugar beets a little bit tougher in the 2022 season for sure. Wanted to break that down just a little bit really quickly. Not all crops obviously lend themselves to high nitrogen. For soybeans, generally only produce the nitrogen that they need, so they usually come out of their crop pretty nice. Wheat can have a penalty for putting too much nitrogen. These are actual numbers, 0 to 4 that I've got circled. But I do want to bring to your attention, take a look at the nitrate levels, 0 to 4 or 0 to 42 in the corn and sweet corn. And in particular, although we probably don't have a lot of it, silage had the double whammy, okay? We generally take off silage a little bit earlier. We had a drought season, so it was taken off before we got some of the rains and mineralization. Really didn't have the moisture to take it up, and those are some pretty outstandingly high levels of nitrate. So if you've got a chance before you get into your sugar beet fields for 2022, and I know that's a limited window, try to get a glimpse of what you guys have in that nitrate level in your soil. Now, jumping back to ESTESA-SWEET before I try to finish up with some database information. The primary risks, there are some. We know that it's new. So similar to learning a whole new language, the early use and interpretations of this particular tool is going to require some extensive caution. We can't just jump into things because we want to make sure that we avoid any hasty conclusions that could end up costing us more than the benefit. And it cannot. And similarly to EST and ESA, it cannot assess input costs. So we can't understand that side of any grower's operation, right? We can only look at the revenue per acre. But the benefits may include, with careful utility and interpretation, both ESTESA and ESTESA-SWEET can provide value by finally providing a means to investigate the profitability traits of successful sugar beet operations and to be able to disseminate them, because we can't disseminate financials, but now we can disseminate them by an ESTESA score that's a little more protective to key influencers such as consultants and universities and shareholders to make the whole beet payment pie even bigger. And for the first time, to be able to do so in such an innocuous way that it does not give away overall or too much general sugar beet income or financials to any outside entities. We can discreetly and anonymously peel back layers of profitable sugar beet production without giving away personal or cooperative information. We can provide an alternative measurement of crop inputs. I'll use the nitrogen example again. That is tightly tied to shareholder profitability for use with relative production comparisons. So when the research staff examines some of these inputs, we can apply an ESTESA score and get an idea, just another tool at which ones are going to create the greatest opportunity for shareholder advancement. As we continue to ask these questions, certainly more utility has the potential to come for this particular measurement tool. The next steps. Well, if this is the list, and some of you are going to be taking screenshots here, right? But this is the actual list ranked from 1 to 40. Now, there's more than that, okay? And that is not the ESTESA. I'm just ranking them from top to bottom of the ESTESA. And they all have their ESTESA scores starting at 709. Those are the creme de la creme. They are the best of the best from an operation perspective. Perhaps we might gravitate towards a subdivision of the Sweet Society that accesses their lofty goal from strong dedication to quality in particular. Those would be the ones that I've highlighted with a star. I might even point out this particular one because they are right next to each other. These two operations rank 14 and 15. They both have a 663 ESTESA score, one of them getting their ESTESA score quite a bit more from a tonnage perspective, the other one getting it from both quality and purity. So we start looking at some of these comparisons of operations, and we can start to make some assessments of how to produce a high quality, high profitable beet crop and do it in a way that doesn't forget about the sugar parameter. All right, real quick. I'm hoping, I got a little less time than I thought. I'm gonna crank through this one. We're gonna talk a little bit about sucrose release spot from your database perspective. All right, we're managing sucrose release spot in a different world now. We've got a fair jag of this HCT or CR plus level of genetics for sucrose release spot tolerance. So we've had a relatively successful 2020. I'm going to say we had a successful 2021. There were some fields that burnt. You guys saw them, but we had as hot and warm and humid as a September and early October as I've seen in a long time. I not once have ever seen the cooperative shut down to the 10th of October for full harvest because of that kind of heat and humidity. We've not harvested till a little later, but not because of this kind of heat. So we had enormous pressure this year. But where do we go from here? Do we stay the course? I think not. When you start having this kind of sucrose release spot tolerance in your varieties, I don't think that we generally take care of it the same way. And David Mettler will certainly talk to you about that. Certainly there's going to be different strategies. Or do we follow this guy? Now, every year I have to include somebody from the baby boomer generation. And I had one of the younger folks tell me that I have to probably explain this. This is Rod Serling from the Twilight Zone, by the way. And at the beginning of every show, he would say, there's a signpost up ahead. Your next stop is where? The Twilight Zone. In this case, we're going to try and figure out where we're going with these new HCT varieties, because folks, there are some implications with managing highly sucrose tolerant varieties simultaneously with your traditional varieties. And it's actually got me concerned. Shareholders, by the ag staff's admission, ordered a sizable amount of the HCT or the CR plus varieties with a totally different strategy that David's going to talk with you about than our traditional varieties. This is going to demand some considerably more planning and record keeping to avoid any program or application errors. Let's face it, you make an extra application to a CR plus, you just wasted some money. But if you miss an application on your traditionals, we all know that you can't do that. It's going to show up really quickly. We also know that sucrose release spot control in traditional varieties is heavily dependent upon correct and standardized visual ratings. We're all getting very familiar with these ratings, and that's a big plus because now we can speak the same language when we're talking to one another. But don't forget that the HCT varieties are not resistant. They're still going to require scouting and infection ratings. It's very important. I'm going to make a plea, just a flat out plea. If you've got a fair jag of both traditional and the HCTs, I'm asking you to not only have a spreadsheet such as this, and I know that I probably take things to greater distances than they need to, but I'm asking you to put a whiteboard in your shop so everybody in your operation knows where your traditional varieties are, what the name of the field is, and how you're going to take care of them. I don't care if you include every column that I have here, but you really should be able to talk the same language within your group on where these fields are so you know exactly what's going on. As the harvest approaches, I'm going to ask you to consider that you add things like covered through date. Start going out and take your CLS rating so you know what the rating is and when you might be considering to harvest that in the particular sequence so that we do not make any train wreck mistakes, because that's a lot of stuff to juggle in the air and there's a lot of different people in all of your operations. In regard to the importance of standardized ratings, I know how important that is because I get a lot of calls because people don't have the confidence to go out and rate their own fields. So I know that the cornier it is, the more likely you're going to remember it. So I'm going to give you a corny rhyme to assist you achieving rating standardization. I wouldn't ask you to do it if I didn't do it myself. I actually use this process when I'm out in the fields doing 200 plus fields in a given year. If standardization of sucrose release spot infection categories is key, use a consistent field rating methodology that revolves around P. All right, so what does that mean? I'm going to say that this proposed methodology only works for the first 5 categories. But I'll also say that if you reach category 6, you're probably behind the 8 ball already. And I'll also say that category 6, and I can vouch for this, I think everybody in the room, all the ag staff, you can see that, start to see that brown hue from the road, traveling down the road at 55 miles per hour. So you know what a 6 is. So anytime you're before a 6, you can go out in the field and use this particular methodology. If I walk out in the field and it's just problematic to even find a spot, I have to walk 50, 60 feet steps before I can find a stop, or maybe 100 steps before I can even find one. I'm going to say that that's a category 1 or less. If it's present, but it's not very apparent, you just got to really kind of look for it, you probably reach category 2. If it's apparent, meaning you really don't have to go look for it, it's fairly obvious when you walk out in the field, I'm calling that a category 3. But if it's prevalent, you really don't, it's just basically everywhere you look, you're already at category 4. All right. Honestly, I walk out in the field and I actually say these words. It makes it really easy for me because as your mind processes things this way. So if you think about it this way, you can really hone in on getting an accurate score. I do want to make sure that you remember that 3 and 4 is the goal for going into defoliator in October, because that is the point of no return. Once you reach 3 or 4, it slides pretty quickly into the abyss. Whereas the goal for the end of August is probably in the category 1 to 2. I might add that I also say that a prominent, okay, number 5 is a prominent. If it's even above apparent, then it's probably, or above prevalent, it's probably reached the prominent stage, okay? Some of you said, hey, I burned down this year. Did the 70-day challenge really work? For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the 70-day challenge is that goal-based shareholder incentive to start early and keep traditional varieties disease-free through the end of August. That's really simple, right? It's got 7 days in June, 31 days in July, 31 days in August. That means on September 1st, we're talking about the 70th day, with the premise being that if your CLS spots, if you're rating your fields is still problematic to find or at best early present, then you can continue to monitor in hopes of not requiring another spray. 2021 threw us another little wrench, and that works because it stayed warm and some of those fields heated up pretty well. But I do want to tell you, I think that this model that we created using some of David's and the research staff's own successful leaf spot nurseries and your own fields, these rate of gains, these rate of infections are pretty close. Let me show you why I think so. If I take a look at a particular field that I was monitoring, and I started rating it right on the 31st of August on the last day of coverage of their last fungicide, you would have expected it to progress with that blue line because it started at about a 0.5. The black line is the actual representation of the ratings that I gave it. So looks to me like it followed the progression curve that we would have perhaps expected it to, not reaching that danger zone until the 7th of October. Here's a field where I had a guy skip a strip. It's one of those skip strips that we looked at that I don't have time to talk about, but this fella had a 1 on the 20th of August on his last day of fungicide coverage. It stayed a little bit low, but remember, we didn't start getting rain until the 26th of August. That was the day we started getting rain, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe it was the 20th, but anyway, 26th, I believe. So it really started out slow, but then started to really ramp up. We would expected it to follow that orange line, and by the time it was done, it was pretty close. It got so scary at that time that we actually pulled the pin and had him harvest that skipped area on the 16th of September because we were afraid that it was going to affect the rest of his field. So I would say, as far as the model goes, we have 2 years of observations. And based upon 2021, I say that if and when the model errs, now this is for traditional varieties, I got to remind you, it consistently overestimates the disease progression, thus limiting any occurrence of any surprise debacles happening in the field. Here's my last topic. I know I'm running short of time. Do I have time, David? Super. This is it. Shock and awe spray management, especially for everything you do, whether it's HCT or your traditionals. Fungicide spray day is the only day you possess the power to eliminate disease choices. Now, everyone says diseases don't have brains. They don't make choices. But I'm going to help you picture this. Okay, you spray, okay, and it dries on the leaf. You can never get 100% coverage. So some of the hyphae are left unsprayed, right? So the next day it re-wets, right? We expect that we have some residual, but do you think that that hyphae is going to grow into that deposited spot? Probably not. It's going to bump into it and turn the other direction, or even if it does kill it at the terminal end, it's going to branch off on another portion of the hyphae. So the day you spray is the day you can maximize coverage and give the disease no chance to decide to grow away from it. It's because if you cover it, chances are you're going to get control of it on that particular day. So shock and awe spray management recognizes that a good day, a good spray day, is a good day to spray. Monitor your DIVs and modify your spray intervals within reason to seek the best timing windows for ideal spray conditions to increase your coverage and your efficacy. There may be times when you may want to spray 2 days sooner than your program would maybe suggest, or maybe even 1 or 2 days later, rather than spraying in really adverse spray conditions so that you can maximize your shock and awe coverage. Lastly, last year, your your ag staff asks you some questions when you are contracting. One of the questions was, what adjustments have you made to your cost release spot program? Your answers were in order of percentage of operations doing so. Was earlier start date was had the most changes, spray additives, spray volume, spray pressure, spray nozzle recs, and time of day. I want to bring to your attention that if you add up the percentages, it comes up to about 300%. That means that on average, many of you are making multiple changes. Some of you may have already been doing the right thing and only made 3 changes, but on average, you all made 3 adjustments to your cost release spot program to increase the control that we've been able to obtain the last couple of years. If you remember my 6 secrets of spraying success from last year's meeting, I got to say, well done. Because if you look at the list in the little screenshot that I bring in the bottom, compared to what you guys have done, you've all recognized the value of the information you've gained from that group of shareholders that shared their successful cost release spot program information in order to allow us to figure out how to get the shock and awe coverage we need to survive till we got to these CR plus varieties. In summary, ESTESA if we go back to ESTESA, provides an extremely accurate yet non-intrusive method to make relative assessments of sugar beet production / revenue success relating to your profitability. And quite frankly, an ESA divided by 2 times the decimal equivalent of ES equation is pretty easy to calculate at any farm level. So I'm going to ask you to go home, run these on your own fields in your own operation. Just remember that the field level, if you're batting at a 500 or better, you're over average. And if you're playing in that 750 range, you're approaching the extraordinary range. On an operation level, changes a little bit. 500 is still average. 650 is considered exceptional. From a cost release spot perspective, stay the course. Watch your vids on those videos on database info. Don't underestimate your CR plus, but certainly use them appropriately based upon what David's going to tell you in the next presentation. 2022, in my opinion, is not going to be easy when you're trying to manage both of these particular cost release spot models. So make sure that you have a good record keeping perspective in your shops. I would have to say, after watching sugar beets now for quite a few years, that every 10 years or so, we seem to either lose a mode of action or lose respect for this disease. 2016 isn't that many years in the rearview mirror, and neither is 2018, but let's not get complacent just because we've got a new tool, because this disease has proven over and over that it will take advantage of us as soon as we let our guard down. With that, I apologize for taking over my time. I will get the heck out of here. I'll answer any questions if you have any on the chat.
All right.